Up next, we have our interview with Dr. Rita Louise. She's a medical intuitive and a 20-year veteran of the alternative health field. But we first came across Rita when she was a last-minute addition to the Paradigm Symposium last year. And she only had a short amount of time to speak. And it was on the third day, so everyone was kind of exhausted by that stage. But she was still fascinating to listen to. And when we had the chance to get her on the show, we jumped at it. But today we won't be talking about alternative health. We're actually going to be talking about her book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. We hope you enjoy the interview, and if you want to find out more about Rita, you can head to our show notes at mysteriousuniverse.org. Just look for Season 9, Episode 5, but her main site is soulhealer.com. Joining us on the show today is author Dr. Rita Louise, the founder of the Institute of Applied Energetics and the host of Just Energy Radio. We're here to talk about her new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Rita. How are you?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me on Down Under.
You sound incredible. Got to be one of the best sounding guests we've had in a long time, because you've got your own radio show, of course, so we were excited to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much. No one's ever complimented me right off the top on my good sound.
Yeah, we're just used to these horrible Skype calls, with really bad microphones. So it's a refreshing change. You're actually our first interview in this new studio. So we've got our fingers crossed that everything's going to hold together. We've already had some pieces of equipment crash when we've been talking about ghosts and hauntings before the interview. But today...
It's just a coincidence, we'll call it that.
But today we're going to be going into ancient history. And of course, we came across you at the Paradigm Symposium and got to hear your great talk there. How was the symposium for you?
It was a whirlwind. I mean, I was so excited to get there, and then it was just like nonstop activity, hanging around with great people, rubbing elbows with Eric Von Donigan. And, because I have my own show, I've had, actually just about everybody that spoke at the conference on my show. So it was kind of like homecoming too. So it was really nice. And my highlight of the entire show was Georgios Zouklos was signing autographs. So I got in line, got a pair of those cool airplane earrings that he had for sale. And, but mostly I wanted to just, say hi, get a picture to put on my webpage, blah, blah, blah. And I get up to the front of the line and I'm like, hi, Giorgio, I'm Rita Louise. And he was like, oh, Rita. And he gives me this huge hug. And it was like... He likes me.
Oh, you fell under the Zouklos charm, like many of the ladies before you.
I got this big old smile on my face even today, just thinking about it.
The Paradigm Symposium absolutely was a whirlwind for us too. I mean, we were completely exhausted by that, one of those final days. And when you gave your talk, I think it was towards the winding up of the conference. But I was saying to you earlier, you still caught our attention. It was still, fascinating to hear you speak about these connections within different cultures and the connections between their folklore. And I guess it's interesting because your history is in alternative healing, in the alternative medical field. So what was your inspiration to dive into this topic of ancient history and possible ancient aliens?
There is the alternative health work, but really to get the background in it, I have spent years studying ancient esoteric traditions, so learning about the chakras, studying Kabbalah. I have a minor in art history. I've always been interested in archaeology and anthropology, art history, and anything past the Romans, it really got boring to me. So the older, the better. And so, venturing into this area was not an unknown field, although the mythological part of it was a little bit new to me. And it was fascinating just exploring that whole area.
Do you think there's actually truth to be found in folklore? Do you think the legends and traditions are more than just myths? Is there truth within them?
Well, when you see things that are parallel, one of the things that we discovered in writing this book was the overwhelming similarities of stories that you find in cultures around the world, whether it's Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, South America, and Australia. And when you have all of these groups basically saying the same things.
Well, Rita, that's why I really enjoyed your book, because this comparative analysis that you performed of these sacred texts and these different cultural beliefs, it's incredibly supportive of your arguments. With these similarities, what did you find to be the most compelling and, in your opinion, the most surprising?
Well, I mean, this was one of our first discoveries, which really propelled us into digging deeper. And it actually started because of the whole 2012 phenomena, where they were talking about, the Mayans say this, and then this was on these TV shows, and then they would say, well, in the Hindu tradition, they say the same thing, and in Egypt, they say the same thing, but they never said what they said, which irritated me. And so I started digging and ran across a series of books called the Vishnu Purana, because I'm one of those people that will read those dry old books with the dust all on the top and find them interesting.
Yeah, right.
And I read that, and one of the stories that they share in there is the story of Manu and the fish. And that story was remarkably like the tale of Noah and the ark, which made me think, well, they say that there are 250 flood stories around the world, which, in my research, I found that number was vastly underrated. But anyway, and so I started digging around looking at flood myths and started noticing that there were a lot of similarities. And I literally got a piece of paper and I started making headers, built a boat, was warned about the flood, and just these generic headers. And then if a culture talked about they built a boat, I listed the culture in that category. But I figured I would have a lot of different things and they would be very regional in nature. And in the end of doing all of this, it basically ended up being kind of one paragraph, which stated, a righteous, pious, or virtuous man is warned of an impending flood. He builds a boat, an ark, digs a canoe, climbs a tree, or climbs to the top of the mountain. He survives with his wife, maybe his sister, kind of creepy, but anyway, maybe his brother or a father or an uncle, a very small group of people. In some of the stories, there are children. In a few of the myths, an animal is released, sometimes a bird, sometimes some other animal. And that was it. I mean, that was, for the majority, all of the categories that I had on my spreadsheet.
And again, how many different cultures are we talking about here?
I mean, in the ones that I evaluated, I probably looked at 50 to 100 different flood myths, but we are talking on every continent.
Gosh, that's incredible.
And the part that was really compelling with that was that in North America, for example, they would build a boat, climb the mountain, and climb the tree. In Europe, they built the boat, climbed the mountain, climbed the tree. So it wasn't even like in the Middle East, they built a boat. In North America, they climbed a mountain. They were just kind of scattered around all over the place.
Couldn't one of the arguments for these similarities be that we simply had ancient trade routes, regional contact, perhaps even belief systems and religions were more widespread than we understand among ancient cultures? I mean, is that a possibility? I
mean, that was an area that we had explored. But where it starts getting sticky is when you talk about the Americas, for one, and where it gets even more sticky is when you're talking about Australia. Because when you look at Australia culturally, they are really far behind the curve.
Yeah, we're very backwards down here.
Oh, that's right.
Well, we're ex-criminals.
Oops.
No, I understand what you're saying. Yeah,
but I mean, when the white people came and interacted with the indigenous population, they had no cities. They did not build permanent structures. They have no agriculture. They have basically no domesticated animals other than dogs. And so when you compare that to other groups, the trade routes would have had to have happened really early on, because early agriculture was at least 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago.
Yeah, so this could suggest that there was, a widespread, maybe an advanced civilization going back further than we currently understand. But that's a topic we'll go into in a second. But One of the questions I wanted to ask is when ancient cultures speak of gods, what evidence do we have that they weren't simply speaking about beings of a ethereal or spiritual nature?
Well, when we think of God, I think first we need to kind of separate out, there's God, the omnipotent creator, so even if these were aliens, somebody had to create the aliens and somebody had to create the place that they came from, and back and back and back and back. And we're calling that omnipotent whatever God. We don't know what it is, and we're not trying to claim we know what it is. And then there's who we meet in the myths and legends, which George Zouklos likes to call the little g gods.
Right, so we have a big G god and little g gods.
And little g god.
Okay.
And when we think of God in the generic sense of the word, God can create anything at whim. He can, blink his eyes or wiggle his nose or nod his head or wave his hand and poof, there's a margarita. It's easy.
That's my kind of God.
Well, don't you think God I always think of Q from Star Trek Next Generation. He wants something, poof, there it is.
Yeah.
That's how we think of God. When we see God in the myths, that's not what we find. We find these people, and I'll say people, entities, beings that have amazing weapons, to get from one place to another. They don't nod their head and teleport to somewhere else. They climb in these chariots or climb on a cloud and fly through the sky. And even though they are identified as being immortal, there are gods that do die and are killed. And so how can you be God and die?
And when we talk about the similarities between the legends of the Great Flood, this is what I loved about your talk at the Paradigm Symposium, was the similarities you pointed out in between the symbology of gods across cultures. And you had these fascinating examples of Thor's hammer that somehow linked to Australian legend.
Exactly. And I'll share that story with you, or, the little connections. And so in Norse mythology, there's Thor, and Thor's weapon is a hammer. And the characteristic of this hammer is that it is a weapon that once it's thrown, after it levels the mountain or hits whoever he's aiming it at, will automatically come back to his hand.
Like a boomerang.
That's right. In Australia, actually, the woomerang. But in Australia, there's a legend that talks about the two Akiri brothers who were interacting with this god named Kadili. And Kadili wanted to have relations with the women on Earth, which the Wakari brothers didn't want to have happen. And so one of them used his woomerang and castrated Kadili. Now, keep that little piece in mind because we're flying back across the earth to Greece. And so when we look at the early Greek mythology, chronologically speaking, one of the progenitor gods was Uranus. And Gaia wanted to get rid of Uranus. And so she got her son Kronos to, her Titan children to go against Kronos. And so she gave him a sickle, which looks remarkably like a boomerang. And to lure Kronos in, they waited for Uranus to want to have relations with the Earth, aka Gaia. And when he was going to go do the dirty deed, Kronos, taking that sickle, castrated him. So now we have this tie of this weapon that can be thrown and be retrieved, and two stories of castration, but they're found all over the world.
It boggles the mind. That argument, that coincidence kind of disintegrates when you start to add up all these similarities. What other notable connections did you notice across cultures that you can recall?
Well, even when we talk about the gods themselves, there is the belief that in Mesoamerica, we have Quetzalcoatl, and in South America, we have Viracocha, and in Sumeria, we have Enki. But many times, the names that these gods have are not their name, in my belief, but more their title. For example, we were talking about Gaia, and Gaia, the word Gaia means earth. But she's always associated with being Mother Earth. But in Mesoamerica, there is a god called Ciclalique, and Ciclalique translates as Mother Earth or Earth Mother. So is it their title? And we're calling them by their title. But when you look at the attributes of these gods, they are doing the same things. If it's a fertility god, it's always associated with water. It is always associated with the creation and or education of mankind. If we're talking about a sky god, he's always associated with lightning. He's always associated with rule and requiring that we follow the rules or else consequences. And so our belief is that we're really not talking about a Mesoamerican god or a South American god or, a Chinese god, but that we're talking about this same group of gods that have gotten different names because they're talking about a title.
Do we have connections in physical descriptions as well of the gods? I mean, if we were to form an image in our mind of these ancient beings, is that left in ancient texts? Do we have those physical attributes that we can connect across cultures as well?
Yes and no. It gets a little bit thin, and I think that's where it leads to a lot of the confusion that gets experienced because they will talk about themselves or they'll talk about some other group, and we assume that they're talking about humans, like us humans. And that might not necessarily be the case. Like, I believe that there are a lot of stories, for example, in the Ramayana. The Ramayana is the story about Rama, and his wife gets kidnapped, and he spends a lot of time, other than whining, trying to get her back. And he's a whiner. It was a very interesting story, though. I really enjoyed it. And they are portrayed as being regular people, but I believe, and I'm kind of making a little bit of an assumption here, that they were actually the race of giants that were on the earth. Not the Titans, which is a different group, but the race of the 8 to 10 foot giants. And I say that for one very specific reason. In the Ramayana, it talks about a group called the Vanir. Here, yet another interesting tie. And so when Rama was born, let me get the story straight in my head. When Rama was born, they knew what was going to happen to him. And so Vishnu, the supreme god, got all of the other gods to have relations with the people on earth, the monkeys, the apes, in particular, apes and bears on the earth. And so these demigods came out of these relationships and had all these powers. And so then when Rama went to get his wife from the evil god in Lanka, he had this army of ape men to fight this battle. Time-wise, the Ramayana is supposed to be set in the Treta Yuga, which is about 1.7 million years ago, which is right around the time of Homo erectus.
Yeah, we're starting to get clues into why you gave your book that title, Man-Made. And I want to come back to that because I want to try and establish a timeline here. I'm glad that you mentioned the Yugas because that'll be fun to go into. But another thing I wanted to briefly touch on, we know about the Vimanas from the Indian texts, but you also mentioned in the book examples of the technology of the gods, but also the palaces in the skies, the home of the gods, and the methods they use for transport. Were there links across cultures with those descriptions as well?
There were. Well, first in India, I mean, this was one of the things that kind of blew me away. And this came right out of the Mahabharata, where they talk about these things called sabas. And I'm just kind of condensing this all really small. But basically, the smallest one was like, and I don't have the exact number, but it's still huge, was like 100 miles by 300 miles, like in width and length. I mean, that's huge.
They're like, almost you get the sense of a flying city.
But when they talk about the home of the gods, we think of the home of the gods as heaven, but there was more than one. There are characteristically talked about either 4 or 5 of these homes of the gods. But they don't talk about just like a little shack hanging out in the clouds, they talk about these cities with palaces for Zeus, and all of the lesser gods have these grand homes, and there are plants and trees and animals and all of this stuff in these abodes. And so you would need for it to be a small city, maybe a big city. I don't know.
Rita, is it drawing a long bow to assume that these gods are extraterrestrial, that these could be spacecraft of some kind that they're living on?
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point. It gets really confusing. I mean, we definitely believe that the progenitor gods, the ones that came here originally and helped terraform the planet and start life here on Earth, were extraterrestrial. It does seem fairly clear from mythology. They talk about it, the concept of the cosmic egg in the void, or floating through the waters and having all of the things necessary for life. All of the plants are in this thing, and all of the animals and the trees, and and it gets here and they come out.
Many different cultures describe that, right?
Many different cultures describe that. In that cosmic egg, they talk, usually the number 8 comes up. There were 8 progenitor gods, and these progenitor gods are typically depicted as being half man, half snake, half man, half fish, half man, some reptilian / aquatic type creature. After that, it gets a little confusing, because that group had children, according to some myths. In other myths, they created a race of giants, which would be the Titans. So these guys were so big, as I like to say, they could pick you up and bite your head off big. Not the 9 to 12 foot giants. They wouldn't really be big enough.
Giants.
They were Titans. And and that would be like that Kronos group. So like Uranus's son was Kronos and the Titans. Those were the first iteration. Now, whether they were created or whether they were the children, a little hard to tell. But Kronos, and I'll just kind of stick with Greek mythology because I think people know those names. Kronos was usurped by Zeus. Kronos and the Titans, I mean, when you see a clash of the Titans, I mean, what they're talking about is that earlier generation of gods. And that's where it gets kind of interesting, because even though Zeus is supposed to be Kronos' son, they seem like it's a different group, and it makes me wonder, even though I don't have any hard evidence mythologically or anything, whether they weren't another race of extraterrestrials that actually came in and fought for dominion over the Earth.
That's what can be inferred. They're warring with each other to get control of this planet.
Exactly. I mean, they definitely are warring to get control of the planet, but were they a connected race? Were they different? What were the relationships? Because when you look at the descriptions, we have these half men, half fish, aquatic group.
Are these the Nomo?
Yes. I mean, that they were the half men, but when we talk about the progenitors, and the Ogdad, which is an Egyptian word, they were half man, half frog, half man, half crocodile. Cycloleque was described as being an alligator.
Yes.
And so, but she was a progenitor god. She is the earth mother. She would be tied to Gaia. But even in Sumerian literature, we have Tiamat, who is described as being a dragon or a snake. Then they also talk about giants. I mean, there were the Titans, who were giants, but then there are giants, and there are a number of cultures that talk about dwarfs, ones that talk about monsters. In Indian mythology, there is the story of the churning of the Milky Ocean, and the good gods, they were the white guys, were on one side, and then there was everybody else, all the riffraff on the other side. Well, if you look at the pictures, it's really interesting. They have these like upstanding looking god characters on one side, and then they have these guys with like horns and fangs, and they just don't look that good, or not want to meet in an alley. Okay. And they're the bad gods.
I think we should go back and start talking about the timeline here, because from what you've said earlier, we certainly have a good indication that there was some event in the past similar to a great worldwide flood, some worldwide calamity. Enough cultures mention that for us to safely assume that that did happen. But what's interesting is you point out there isn't any real solid geological evidence for that happening within the last kind of 20,000 or 10,000 years. So if we take that into account, when we're talking about progenitor gods and we're talking about yugas and these cycles of time, how far back are we going, to even start to contemplate the existence of the progenitors and then what followed? How long is this timeline?
Well, I mean, where we put the timeline, and that's one area that we're open to be corrected. How's that? But where we put it was actually with the formation of the earth. And so we put actually the second group of gods, the Kronos group of gods, coming to the earth about 3.8 million years ago and actually terraforming the planet.
For what purpose did they terraform the planet? Was that for the creation of man? And are we a slave race? Is that why we exist as we do today?
Well, it's not something that they talk about at all, why they're here. They don't talk about it at all. It's really annoying. And I looked for that one. And a lot of people like to say that slave race thing. And I disagree with that word. Maybe not the concept in a general sense, but I think that we were bred as a domesticated race. When we think of horses, when we think of donkeys, when we think, I don't want to say cows because we eat cows, but
let's stick with donkeys.
Donkeys is fine. Yeah.
But they're domesticated to be animals of labor. We ride horses. They pull carts, and that's kind of their role. And we take care of them. That's part of the whole domesticated thing is they get something from us and we take care of them. And it seems more like our relationship to the gods is more of that dynamic. When we think of slaves, and it might be a cultural thing, we think of, like cracking the whip. That's what we think of slaves, but that's not the relationship that we see.
So let's try and put this into a sequence. If we have the progenitor gods going that far back, what do we have following that eventually leads to mankind? Because there's a lot of stuff in between that's mentioned in mythology. We have the giants, of course. We have mention of dwarves and gnomes from mythology. How does that fit in to this history?
Okay, here's the 5-minute.
Right, the compressed, ultra compressed version.
Doing, you were talking about Paradigm Symposium, and originally I was only going to have a half hour. And so I was like, here, I'm going to do the whole history of our planet to the William Tell Overture.
You did a pretty good job. Did a pretty good job. I think you could probably do it in 4 minutes.
No, I can whoop through it. And so we had our progenitor gods, and they created a race of beings who were and I'll say Titans, the big giant people. We believe that group is actually the group that came to Earth first. One of the things we speculated is that the original progenitor gods were on Mars, which we can come back to if you want to, but we'll just leave them on Mars for now. And that it was the Kronos group that came to the Earth and set up shop, either under the water or in the earth. And they were here hanging out, getting life happening. And then a long time later is when we have the sky gods. We have Zeus and his whole group coming in and taking over control. And we estimated that, and I'm just kind of pulling a number out, about 450 million years ago. And there was a very specific reason why we dated it so far back. Yeah,
well, you would think that number, it comes out of nowhere, but we do have, for example, the Egyptian Book of Kings, which goes back insurmountable amounts of time, and we have the Yugas as well. So there are historical things to draw upon, correct?
Well, I mean, but that's not really where we went. So when you read mythology, there are actually, we believe, two separate flood stories. There's the Noah flood story, and then there's a different flood story. Because the first flood story occurs on a planet where they live in darkness or semi-darkness. Okay, which is, it wasn't just they're two different stories. It's like there's a consistency.
So the mythology may go back beyond our planet. It may go back to Mars as the example you used before, or the whatever origin planet we had of these gods.
And so one of the things we found in mythology is after the big war, after the war between Kronos and Zeus, there is a narrative that says, well, I'll use Norse, and so they killed the giant Ymir, and they used his body, and his teeth became the mountains, and his hair became the trees, and his blood became the rivers. We find the same story coming out of Mesoamerica, where Cicloleque is actually killed, and her body is used to form the mountains and the rivers and the trees. So that was one piece of it. But then the other piece, which was really interesting, was after that happened, then the sun, the moon, and the stars were put in the sky. Well, from an evolutionary point of view, it wasn't much after the plants were on the surface of the planet that life started moving onto the dry land. And so we kind of threw out that maybe the sun, the moon, and the sky weren't in the sky because nobody could see them, because life at that point in time was underwater. So I have another parallel, because we actually find the same narrative in the Bible. On the third day of the Bible, it says God created the plants and the trees and the blah, blah, blah. And then on the fourth day, he put the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky. Now, when you first read that in and of itself, you think, well, they got the days mixed up, because how can you have trees and plants with no sun? I mean, there's a thing called photosynthesis. But what happened was that all of the other myths validate that biblical thing. And so to me, that says the order they have it in the Bible is correct.
It's a fun thing to think that Mars was a possible element in that timeline, that it's a dying planet, and I mean that would provide the motive for seeking out the terraforming of a new location.
Well, I was just kind of goofing around. One of the things, it took us a long time to figure out, because in a number of cultures, they talk about 5 worlds. Like we just ended the 5th cycle of the Mayan calendar, but there were 5 worlds. But in the Yuga system, there are 4. And it took us a long time to figure out how those two systems work together. And what we finally tracked down was there was a world that happened prior to the Golden Age, which in many of these cultures saw as the first world. So, for example, Uranus, he had his thing. Kronos took over. When Kronos lived, it was a Golden Age. Well, the first Yuga was a Golden Age. And so there is a time, that's where there was a new beginning. And I'm like, a new beginning? Well, I wonder if they had a new beginning because they had a new beginning somewhere else, because there are myths that suggest that this renegade group, this Kronos group, they rebelled and then they took off, or they were kicked out of wherever they were. So then I was like, hey, maybe they were on Mars. They got those faces up there.
Well, allegedly.
It was just on a whim. It started on a whim. And I go, well, let me go check it out. And, we're talking about these coincidences. And one of the things that we found out about Mars was that, all right, this solar system came into existence 4.5 billion years ago. Now, what scientists can't figure out, I love when scientists can't figure out stuff, because that's usually where something remarkable happens. So within 2 million years, according to scientists, if life was going to develop on Mars, that was the period of time.
Ah,
interesting.
Another coincidence.
Nice correlation.
So can I ask, Rita, then, I mean, a lot of skeptics would say, well, there's no evidence that there was anyone on Mars. I mean, even we jokingly just said, well, allegedly there's faces on Mars. What about anything on Earth? Did you come across any type of evidence of subterranean worlds or some type of existence of these super gods that existed long before we were here?
Well, I mean, there's not hard evidence. I mean, unless you start coming into like contemporary ufology and you start talking about things like, the Dulce base and, apparently you guys have one too and stuff like that. And actually, that's the subject of the next book is the whole underworld, the homes of the gods.
Joining us next week, Dr. Rita Louise.
Booked in. You're already booked in for that, Rita.
And I have no idea where that one's going because I've been starting to look into this base stuff and that even gets weird for me. And I'm like, I'm good with weird, but okay. But can I go back to Mars just for 1 second?
Of course, yeah.
One of the things that they keep saying is that there's no life on Mars. There's no life on Mars. However, one of the things that happened on the Earth was there was bacteria and the bacteria was anaerobic. And so that happened in water. And one of the things that occurs is that if there's free floating iron in the water, it will bind with it and form kind of like rust, but it forms iron oxide, which, sinks to the bottom of the water, which is how we have layers of ochre on this planet. Well, one of the things that scientists have discovered is that the reason that Mars is red is because it's covered with iron oxide. Well, iron oxide cannot occur, in my opinion. I mean, unless they can come up with something really good without having that bacteria and water on the planet at one point in time to create.
Right. So it makes sense that it was perhaps a world like ours in the ancient past, very distant past.
But it would also suggest that maybe that's why they described it as being a dim world, a half-lit world. And like I said, we don't have proof that it was Mars, but again, there were a number of very weird coincidences. Mars underwent a lot of bombardment, meteor bombardment. They lost their atmosphere or a lot of their atmosphere. And right in the middle of all of that happening, boom, life appeared on Earth. The same kind of life that was on Mars. It's like, coincidence or not?
I want to ask the question of, again, in mythology, we have these connections with the mention of dwarf-like beings who are the so-called builders of the world. So I like this idea that there's been, certain races created, perhaps almost as a trial one. It's like those guys, they were just a little bit too small. The giants,
too big. We need a Goldilocks race.
They're a little bit too big. Human beings are the ones. So where do they fit in? Is there a place for that kind of mythological being in this timeline? Well,
according to myth, when Kronos came to this planet, there was another race created. And so actually, according to Greek mythology, they were born of the blood of the castrated Uranus. In Norse mythology, it talks about when Ymir is killed. One of the legends is that maggots formed in his flesh and they were transformed into the dwarfs. When you look at mythology, the giants, the monsters, there's kind of this group of monsters that have the fangs and whatever, as well as the dwarfs, all kind of get grouped together. And it gets a little bit confusing who the real builders were, but it's that group. And they're always associated with the North. Always. So the person that built the Sabas, the great homes of the gods, it was the giants or dwarfs, kind of depending on who you talk to. They built all of the amazing weapons. Even when you look at Greek mythology, there's Hephaestus, who was the master builder, master architects for the Greeks. And you go, well, how could that be? But Hephaestus was, according to mythology, deformed. And so he was kind of this outcast because he wasn't perfect like the other ones, which puts him into that kind of monster category as well.
It's so fascinating because, as we're talking about these things, it's like we're sitting here discussing a fantasy novel. But then you have to remind yourself that we have all these connections across different cultures. I keep coming back to that point. Could it just be a coincidence that they all have these little connections? I mean, as a human being, as a researcher, maybe we're just drawing these connections because naturally that's what we do. I keep coming back to that, getting stumped. There are so many. it really is such a wild tale of the true history. And it gets even wilder when we start to talk about why your book is entitled Man-Made, because then we get into genetic manipulation of whatever was on the earth before. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about why you think that man was essentially made by these beings?
More of those little coincidence things that scientists can't figure out is that 3 million years ago, there was our ancestor, which was Australopithecus. They apparently walked upright, but that was pretty much it as far as their connection to us. Was there some genetic engineering that happened prior to that? Possible, but we're not even going to start there. But somewhere between 3 million years ago and 2 million years ago, maybe a little bit after, all right, we were already walking upright, but we learned how to use tools. We lost our hair. We started living in houses. We gained the ability, genetically gained the ability to communicate vocally. All of this stuff happened within the course of less than 2 million years. And scientists can't figure out how that could possibly happen. And if you're a proponent of the theory of evolution, it wasn't even 2 million years. That's just not enough time. Some of the genes that are in humans, especially that vocabulary, the speaking gene, had not changed for 7 million years. And so even some very primitive forms of life have that same gene that we do. But during that 2 million year period, it changed twice.
But could it just be a spontaneous mutation?
It could, but it was pretty coincidental. We went into writing this book, and there's, what you think originally. I went to Catholic school, and my senior project was we had to do, what do you want to be when you grow up? Paper. And so I wanted to be an archaeologist, and, half of my paper was about the theory of evolution, which they really didn't appreciate.
Yes, I could imagine.
They sit there and try to come up with answers, but they don't really work. Even if you read the Bible, especially Genesis, and you change God and put extraterrestrial in there, that story makes so much more sense.
Yeah, this is where we get into the Nephilim and the gods breeding with females of humanity.
But I was shocked, even in your book, you said that the book of Genesis actually speaks of 2 alternative creation accounts. I didn't realize that.
Right. Chapter 1 talks about, on the first day, and then on the 7th day, God creates man. Or male and female, he created them. And then in chapter 2, it kind of reiterates the creation story, but it's not really the same story. And that's when Adam is created and Eve is created from the rib. That's where we get that story. But that's actually in chapter 2, not chapter 1. And, so there's a lot of reasons why they identify as to why there are 2 different creation stories. And the one that struck me was that there were potentially more than one creation of man. And from a mythological perspective, there are multiple stories about the gods creating multiple iterations until they got it right. In Mesoamerica, they talk about, they made a man out of mud, but then when it rained, he melted. And then they made a man out of sticks, but he was stupid and didn't have any feelings, and so they got rid of him. And then they finally decided to use corn and made man out of corn. And what's interesting, they made him out of red, black, yellow, and white corn. Is that yet another coincidence there? They don't say purple corn. In Sumerian mythology, they talk about the creation of man. And, in one of the narratives, they talk about, they made a man, but he couldn't hold his urine. And so that wasn't any good. And one was lame, and they've created a female, but she couldn't reproduce, and so there are multiple iterations of mankind until they came up with something that worked.
Yeah, sounds like a Korean cloning lab.
Well, but see, there are actually other stories that talk about, this kind of genetic manipulation, not necessarily associated with man, happening in these underworld, and underground locations. So, if you just take one myth and look at it by itself, it's one thing. But when you gather them all together and lay them side by side, it really broadens out the picture, and that was one of the things that we really tried to do in the book. I'm kind of making conclusions because it's the only way to talk about it on air, but in the book, we just present the material. Well, this myth says this, and this guy says this, and this group says this in a not boring, fun way.
You make a good point, though. I mean, you have to kind of speculate on the meaning. Otherwise, you're just kind of talking in circles and you're repeating these ancient stories over and over again. I mean, we do the same thing with topics on our show. You have to speculate on what it all means. I mean,
you have to draw conclusions from it.
No one's saying that we can draw absolute proof from stories that are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, which I guess leads me to another question. I'll just jump in front of you, Aaron. I think we should mention this because you use the analogy of Chinese whispers, and that's often used as, I guess, as some form of skepticism against the validity to ancient tales. It's the idea that, well, over time, obviously these tales would be twisted beyond recognition, and what we're left with today is nothing like the original story.
Exactly. And actually, I'm going to add another point that we didn't really expound upon in the book. It was a concept that I just had to really think through, and it took us finishing the book for me to go, oh, and it became like a one-liner in the introduction.
Right.
Is that this is something we definitely feel like we've come pretty much to a conclusion on, is that the stories that we have, the stories that come from deep antiquity that talk about the creation and the formation and these early tales up to and including man and the flood, aren't our stories. We often think that we wrote these stories. We somehow knew about these weapons and flying things when we were just barely out of caves. I don't get it. I don't know who came up with that. But anyway, but we feel like the stories that we have are actually the stories of the gods, and the gods told us their stories, and we have passed down their stories through time. And I mean, they are kind of twisted here and there. One of the things that we had to look for, because some groups left out parts, some groups added parts, but there would always be a key thing. There was a flood and there's somebody warned. That says, hey, we got a Noah story here. So what do they have to say? The concept of the golden age, that was a concept that went through mythology around the world. The concept of the sun, moon, and stars being placed in the sky. And so us piecing this whole thing together, it was like making it a giant Excel spreadsheet with, in the beginning being the very top line, I'm going to say the flood being the very bottom line, and taking these major concepts, the golden age, where does that fit in? Where were the sun, moon, and stars put into place, and where does that fit into this? Another storyline was at the end of this war that the loser was cast into Tartarus, or cast into the underworld, or spent 1,000 years somewhere, but that was another narrative that we found fairly consistent around the planet. And so those were the kinds of things we looked for, and then just let the stories say what they were going to say, because you don't know who's doing the twisting.
Yeah. In these ancient stories, I mean, we have so many cases of, well, let's call them the gods coming forth and bringing humanity out of a primitive state, teaching the basics of culture and civilization. Many examples across folklore. And yet I'm wondering how that fits in with a spiritual history as well, because often these teachers are perhaps the founders of spiritual movements, the founders of religions, and in some of those religious texts we have, of course, the mention of them returning, the teachers returning, the gods returning. So I guess I'm asking, what is the future? If this is our true history and we have had this interaction or have been created by this other source, what does that leave for our future? Will the gods return?
Well, actually, I was thinking about that this afternoon. One of the things, and I'm going to go with the Sumerian source, Berosus. One of the things he talks about, he's one of the people that documented the Sumerian kings list. And his kings list goes back 300,000 years. And one of the things that he talks about are the Onas, the half man, half fish that come out of the water and teach mankind. And so what he reports, because he was a Babylonian priest, so you would think he was kind of in the know to a certain extent. But one of the things he reports is that the Onas appeared to mankind and taught mankind 3 times before the flood and 3 times after the flood. Now, if we're talking about a 300,000 year period, it's not like the gods were coming around every Tuesday afternoon and doing a class.
You have the rise and fall of civilizations. It seems as though that there's that period of time where there are those cycles. There's a dark age, and then a teacher arrives and humanity once again rises up out of that dark age.
And so my thought, and this is just my thought, is that I could see where they would return, but it's not that they left per se. When we go home from work, we say, I'll see you tomorrow, because we're going to come back the next day. We go visit our friends. It's like, well, I'll be back soon. We've kind of put this whole big thing on, well, they're going to return, but they've already been here 6 times, according to Berosus. And it wasn't like they were here every week. There were thousands of years between. Right. And if you think about it, my feeling is that one of the last major interjections into human society and human culture was right at the rise of civilization. So even if we put that at 4,000 BC, 5,000 BC, they haven't been gone all that long.
So we're alone for a while at least.
Well, and then there's the whole thought, are we really alone?
Exactly. So where does that leave us? If you have a domesticated creature and it's not being cared for, what happens to humanity? Do we have to somehow evolve in our own way?
Well, I think that we were trained well enough. I think putting us into cities created a different structure. We do have a level of intelligence that we can care for ourselves. But if you think about it, if anything bad is going on in our lives or anything challenging is going on in our lives, what's the first thing we do? We get down on our hands and knees and start praying. Even though they might not turn up, our natural response is to ask for help.
So after you've put together this huge amount of research in the book and you've looked at all this ancient mythology, are you confident in what we've learnt from this? Do you think that there's more to be discovered? I guess one of the things that we're always looking for is the real solid evidence, and perhaps this is a good place to finish, is to talk about the flood that exists in so many different cultures, and yet we still don't have the geological evidence for it. Do you think that we'll be able to find something in the future, like a lost text, some kind of Rosetta Stone that will tie all this in, where everyone will be able to see the true history of humankind, the true history of that planet? Is that evidence out there?
Even if we had the Rosetta Stone, there would be a huge group of the population that would say, oh, it's just a myth. I think if it came from an archaeological place and it wasn't hidden away somewhere in a vault, that would be better proof than mythological proof. One of the things that I put out in the book is, perhaps we're not finding proof of this flood. Well, there's 2 things. One is that it was a much more localized flood, which is possible, and then if it's this base group of gods spreading the story around the world, they were just talking about what happened in their neighborhood. That's one possibility. But the other possibility is that we're just not going back far enough in time. Or when they're looking back further in time, they're not looking for that kind of information or that kind of material, because people assume that this flood was, in the history of the earth, relatively recent.
Well, we have to congratulate you again on a fascinating book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. And your website is justenergyradio.com, but I believe your main site is soulhealer.com. Is that right?
Soulhealer.com. That is the portal to everything Rita Louise.
Amazing. And what have you got coming up? What are you working on next? You dropped that exciting tidbit of some work on underground stuff. Is that the next project from you? That's
what I'm working on for the next book. And that's just, I get into these ideas. It's like, I should do, something on this. And it takes me to these places where it's like, no way. So yeah. So I don't really know where that's going. I mean, this book just released in October. I mean, literally, it was like, come on, we got to send it to the printer. Will you let us pick your brain in our Plus extension for a few minutes and we can go into some alternative topics? I wouldn't mind asking you some questions that are not related to Man-Made. But can I make one little announcement? Please. Okay, so in June, myself and Brian Forrester, who many people have seen on Ancient Aliens, who, talks about Peru and the elongated heads and stuff like that. He and I are organizing a tour to Peru. We're going to go to Cusco and Sacsayhuaman, the place where it has those giant rocks that are like fit together like a puzzle, and you can't even figure out how they did it ever. We're going to Machu Picchu. We're doing all this stuff. But it's going to be a really cool tour because Brian kind of brings the science and like measure this and how could they do that? I mean, I do that kind of, but that's not my part. My part in this whole thing is, I work as a medical intuitive and I do energy work. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing while we're down there is we're going to be doing some remote viewing on these sites and tapping into the energy of the sites and looking for vortexes and seeing if we can tap into the ancestral spirits of these different sites to see if we can get some information from the sites themselves. Well, now we've got a topic to talk about in our Plus extensions. When's that coming up? That's in June? It is June 1st through 12th. And so if people are interested, they can go to soulhealer.com and look for the picture of Sacsayhuaman, kind of can't miss it, and click on the link and it will give you some more information about the trip. Oh, that sounds incredible. Well, Dr. Rita Louise, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you the best with the book. It was fantastic, and we hope to have you back in the future. Well, thanks for having me, guys. And yes, please, you're so cool. Huge thanks to Rita Louise for appearing on the show. Again, you can find her at soulhealer.com or justenergyradio.com. Looking forward to her new work as well. That sounded intriguing. Definitely. Underground Bases is going to be a lot of fun. I love this book. I mean, we were talking about the coincidences between beliefs in different cultures and mythology and legend. But there's so many of these listed in the book. Obviously, we couldn't cover even a fraction of them in the interview. Well, in all honesty, I really thought that I was ancient aliened out. I thought, I love the Paradox Symposium. I had so much fun, but I said to you at the end of last year, I'm like, we need to take a break from Ancient Aliens. We'll just, sort of go on a different thing. And then we got this book. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to handle it. It was so much fun. Yeah. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It is just great reading about those legends. And like I was saying in the interview, you take a step back and think, this is like a fantasy novel. Like, this is science fiction. How can this have any relation to the true history of the planet? But again, you can't deny that all these connections have got to be more than coincidence. Oh, absolutely. Her comparative analysis of these different cultures and different beliefs and different texts really does support her argument. And that's what made this book so intriguing to me, because there was just these constant, like over and over again, another example of this really interesting coincidence between these cultures. And you think, well, these cultures existed on different parts of the planet. Yeah. These cultures existed across different time zones, across different cultural times. So how is it that they're all the same? Especially when you have connections from ancient Greece to Aboriginal culture in Australia. I mean, you can't get further removed than that. Yeah. And yet they're clearly there. Yeah. The folklore and the mythology has the same symbology. The other thing I really enjoyed was that there was quite a balance that was struck in this book. It was almost like she was not claiming that she had the answers, and that's what I really liked. It was like, well, hey, look, here's the information, here's what I'm drawing. She said that in the interview. I mean, sometimes you have to draw conclusions to get to a point when you're obviously doing an interview. Or make good radio. Exactly. But in the book, it kind of is served up to you where you can look at it and you go, hey, that's interesting, and then you draw your own conclusions from it. So I certainly recommend that you do that yourself.
yourself.
And Rita, of course, was kind enough to stay back for our Plus members. So we've got a great extension coming up where we're going to be delving into completely different topics.
Oh, don't we just?
Spirit possession comes up. Actually,
Spirit possession comes up.
possession of spirits who are doing spirit possession that are possessed by spirits. It's like Inception. It's amazing. That's coming up in our Plus extension. The book, again, is Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. Just head to mysteriousuniverse.org. Look for Season 9, Episode 5. You'll find all of it there in the show notes. We're going to take a quick break here. We've got a lot more coming up on this episode. Stay with us.